Moving into my own place felt surreal, like a taste of real independence I hadn't had in years. The apartment was small, tucked away in an older building in Seattle. It had that worn-in charm, creaky floorboards, walls that probably hadn't seen fresh paint in decades, and narrow hallways that always seemed a little too dark. But I loved it. After years of sharing spaces, I finally had somewhere that was mine. The building was mostly quiet. My neighbors were either older or kept to themselves, and most of the time, the only sounds in the halls were the hum of the lights and the occasional footstep. The peace was something I welcomed, a chance to catch my breath after the chaos of college. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window in my living room, looking out across the small courtyard between my building and the one opposite. That's when I first noticed him. It started as a shadow, just a flicker of movement that I caught out of the corner of my eye. I glanced across the courtyard to the apartment directly opposite mine. The windows were dark, save for one, where a figure stood, just barely visible, watching. I couldn't make out much at first, just the outline of someone, their face hidden in shadow. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, maybe just a curious neighbor, or someone who happened to glance my way. But the next night, the figure was there again, standing in the same spot, staring out across the courtyard. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, it wasn't like they were doing anything wrong. People watch out of their windows all the time, right? Still, it was hard to shake the feeling that those eyes were fixed directly on me. Days passed, and every night he was there. Sometimes he'd stand perfectly still. Other times he'd shift slightly, moving from one side of the window to the other. But he never looked away. It was as if his gaze was locked onto my apartment, following me as I moved from room to room. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a neighbor with a habit of standing by his window. Maybe he was lonely, maybe he just liked the view. But a creeping unease started to settle in, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck every time I looked out. I tried closing my curtains, but the urge to peek to see if he was there gnawed at me until I finally gave in, only to find him standing there, waiting. It was on the seventh night that things changed. I had come home late, exhausted, and ready to collapse into bed, when I felt that familiar pull toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but the unease lingered. I hesitated, hand hovering over the fabric, feeling ridiculous for letting a shadow unsettle me. But something urged me to look, just one more time. I parted the curtains and found him standing there, just like every other night. But this time, he was closer to the glass, his face partially illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight. I could finally make out some details: dark, sunken eyes, an expression that was both blank and intense, like he was staring right through me. A chill ran down my spine, and I dropped the curtain, backing away from the window. I tried to shake it off, but the image of his face, that hollow, unsettling gaze, stayed with me. Every creak and groan of the old apartment felt amplified, each sound making me jump. I didn't know why he was watching me, or if he even knew I noticed, but in that moment I felt like prey, caught in the unblinking stare of something dangerous. I lay in bed that night, wide awake, listening to the silence, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards. Sleep wouldn't come, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, looming in the shadows. Eventually, I got up and pulled the curtains tightly shut, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect me. But as I turned away from the window, I thought I heard something, a faint, distant sound like footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. I held my breath, listening, straining to catch the noise again. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the faintest tap, 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 growing closer. My heart pounded, and I told myself it was just another tenant, someone passing by. But the footsteps stopped just outside my door, lingering, as if someone was standing there, waiting. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I stood in the middle of my dark apartment, staring at the door, willing myself to move, but unable to take a single step. After a few agonizing seconds, the footsteps moved away, fading down the hall. I released a shaky breath, laughing at myself for being so jumpy. But the sense of unease stayed with me, lingering like a shadow in the back of my mind. The next morning, I told myself it had all been in my head, just nerves, just the stress of a new place. But as I left my apartment, a flash of color caught my eye. There, just outside my door, was a small red smear, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. It was nothing, I told myself. Maybe a drop of paint or someone tracking something in from the rain. I brushed it off, trying to ignore the chill that crept up my spine as I made my way down the hallway, away from the silence that seemed to cling to my apartment. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even during the day, with the sun streaming through the windows, my mind kept drifting back to the figure standing across the courtyard, his dark, vacant eyes piercing through the glass as if searching for something inside of me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a weird neighbor with a bad habit. But as the day wore on, I couldn't stop the memory of his face from haunting me. That night, I decided to close the curtains completely, hoping that if I couldn't see him, maybe he'd lose interest. The room felt darker than usual, and every little sound seemed amplified. I tried watching TV, reading a book, even distracting myself with music, but the sense of unease clung to me like a shadow. As I sat there, the silence grew heavier, as if the whole building were holding its breath. I laughed at myself, forcing my thoughts to move elsewhere. I thought about calling a friend, talking to someone, anything to distract myself. But just as I reached for my phone, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway outside my door. At first, I thought it was another tenant, someone coming home late or heading out for the night. But the steps were too slow, almost as if whoever was walking wanted to be heard. The sound grew louder, stopping just outside my door. My heart pounded as I sat frozen, waiting, listening. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, before the footsteps continued, fading down the hall. I took a shaky breath, convincing myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But something about those footsteps felt wrong, as if they didn't belong in this quiet, empty building. I shook my head, determined to ignore it, and went to bed, my nerves on edge. The next morning, I found another small red smear outside my door, a faint trail leading down the hallway. I knelt down, my fingers hovering just above the stain, a chill creeping up my spine. It looked like paint, I told myself, just a careless tenant dragging something in. But as I looked closer, it didn't look like paint. It looked too fresh, too dark, as if it had been left there deliberately. I glanced down the hall, half expecting to see something, someone, watching me. But it was empty, silent. I shook it off, determined to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps, the strange red smear, the weight of that gaze from across the courtyard. That night, I closed the curtains tightly again, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the building felt like a threat, a reminder of that unsettling presence just outside my window. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway. I sat up, heart racing, straining to listen as they stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, my mind racing with a dozen explanations, each one more terrifying than the last. And then I heard it. A faint, almost hesitant tap on my door, like someone testing if I was awake. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and I pressed myself against the wall, clutching my phone in one hand, too terrified to make a sound. The tapping continued, soft, rhythmic, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was there, waiting. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe, until the tapping finally stopped, leaving me in suffocating silence. After a few minutes, the footsteps continued down the hall, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found another smear outside my door, darker this time, more deliberate, as if it had been placed there with intention. I stared at it, my stomach churning, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. It was a warning, I knew that much. But why? And from who? As I made my way down the hall, I felt the weight of eyes on me, that same suffocating presence I'd felt every night. I quickened my pace, desperate to escape, but no matter how far I went, the feeling stayed with me, lingering like a shadow I couldn't shake. That night, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront him, the man across the courtyard, the figure who had been watching me night after night. I waited until dark, until his light was on again, casting that same faint glow across his window. My heart pounded as I gathered the courage to look, parting my curtains just enough to see. There he was, standing in the window, staring directly at me, his face partially obscured by shadows. I tried to hold his gaze, to stare back, to let him know I wasn't afraid. But the longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. There was something wrong with his face, something off about the way he stared, as if he wasn't looking at me but through me. I closed the curtains quickly, my heart racing, my hands trembling. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost mocking, as if he were standing just outside, waiting for me to acknowledge him. And then I heard the footsteps again, coming down the hallway, slower this time, more deliberate, each step a reminder of the danger lurking just beyond my door. My pulse quickened, fear clawing at my mind as I sat frozen, listening, waiting. The footsteps stopped, and the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then a faint scratching sound, like someone dragging their nails across the wood, echoed through the silence. My stomach twisted as the sound grew louder, more insistent, as if someone were trying to claw their way in. And then the scratching stopped, replaced by a low, raspy whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. "I know you're ignoring me." The words hung in the air, taunting, a reminder that no matter how hard I tried to pretend he wasn't there, he would always be watching. I spent the entire next day on edge, replaying that whispered message over and over in my head. "I know you're ignoring me." The words echoed, taunting me, creeping into every thought, every moment of silence. I had no idea who this person was, why they were watching me, or how they could possibly know what I was doing. But one thing was clear: I couldn't stay here. That evening, I packed a small bag, shoving in whatever essentials I could find. I planned to leave, even if just for a night, hoping that some distance would help clear my head, make me see things rationally. Maybe I'd come back tomorrow, or maybe I'd find somewhere else to stay permanently. All I knew was that I needed to get out, away from the figure, the whispers, the strange red stains outside my door. But as the sun began to set, the old, suffocating dread crept back over me. I glanced nervously at the door, half expecting to see another red smear waiting for me. I tried to push the thought away, forcing myself to focus on the plan, the escape. My fingers trembled as I zipped up my bag, clutching it tightly as I prepared to leave. Just as I reached for the doorknob, there it was again, the sound that had haunted me for nights on end. The slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway, each one louder, closer than the last. I froze, my hand hovering over the knob, paralyzed by the creeping realization that I was trapped. The footsteps stopped outside my door. For a moment, everything was silent, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they would go away. But then I heard the faintest scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, a sound that twisted my stomach with fear. My heart pounded, and I backed away from the door, clutching the bag to my chest as if it could protect me. And then I saw it, another red smear appearing beneath the door, spreading slowly, deliberately, like a message written in blood. I watched in horror as the stain grew larger, forming words. "I know you're still in there." The message was a direct challenge, a taunt that left no room for doubt. Whoever this was, they knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, and they weren't going to let me leave. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, turning to the window in desperation. I could feel the presence in the hallway, as if it were pressing against the door, waiting for me to make a move. In a final desperate act, I ripped the curtains open, hoping to find some escape route. But what I saw stopped me cold. There, in the window across the courtyard, was the figure watching me. He was closer now, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes dark and empty, his mouth twisted into a sickening smile. I couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. His gaze was locked onto mine, unblinking, unmoving, and I could almost feel his presence stretching across the courtyard, reaching out toward me. And then, as if he sensed my desperation, he raised one hand, tapping slowly against the glass, each tap echoing in the silent room like a countdown. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled back, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But just as I turned to flee, I heard the doorknob turn. The slow, deliberate click of the lock echoed in the room, filling me with a dread so deep I thought I might collapse. The door swung open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. For a moment, I thought I was alone, that maybe I'd imagined it all. But then a shadow moved, stepping into the room, blocking my escape. My mouth went dry as I watched, paralyzed, as the figure moved forward, each step deliberate, each movement radiating an unnatural calm. He stopped just a few feet away, his face hidden in shadow, and I realized with a sickening certainty that he was waiting for me to acknowledge him, to admit that I'd been watching too. I opened my mouth to scream, to say something, anything. But before I could make a sound, he spoke, his voice low and cold, each word dripping with malice. "You should have never ignored me." With a final, mocking smile, he reached out, his hand brushing against my face, cold and rough, like the touch of something long dead. I staggered back, fear consuming me, and in a last, desperate attempt, I turned and ran, bolting out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, my chest heaving, my mind reeling from the terror that still clung to me. I looked back at the building, half expecting to see him standing in the window, watching me. But the windows were dark, empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of distant traffic. I left everything behind that night, my apartment, my belongings, even my sense of safety. I never returned, never found out who or what that figure was. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway, as if he's still waiting, still watching, still searching for someone to fill the empty gaze that haunts me to this day. I hadn't expected the house to feel this empty. When I first saw it nestled between the towering Vermont pines, surrounded by silence and the occasional call of distant birds, I thought it was perfect. Isolated enough to give me peace, but close enough to the main road that I wouldn't feel completely cut off. But once I'd settled in, the quiet became heavier, and the house, with its creaking floorboards and shadowy corners, seemed to breathe along with me. It was an old farmhouse with weathered beams and worn, squeaky floors that groaned underfoot. The charm was there, hidden beneath decades of dust and chipped paint. It was exactly what I'd needed after my divorce, a place to find myself again and leave the echoes of the past behind. But on that first night, as I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, I felt a strange unease, as if the walls were holding back something unsaid, a story no one had bothered to tell me. The quiet was almost unbearable. I'd forgotten what true silence felt like, the kind that presses in, amplifying every tiny sound until each one feels like it's right next to you. I could hear the ticking of the old grandfather clock down the hall, the rustle of the wind outside, and every once in a while, something that sounded almost like a whisper. I brushed it off as a trick of the wind, some draft weaving its way through the gaps in the walls. Over the next few days, I tried to settle into a routine, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, scrubbing floors. It kept me busy, kept my mind off the growing unease that settled over me every night. The isolation was starting to wear on me, and I found myself calling my mom just to hear a familiar voice, just to remind myself that I wasn't truly alone. I'd lie in bed after each call, replaying our conversation in my head, her voice calming the creeping anxiety that came with each evening. But then, one night, I heard it. It was a soft, familiar sound, just barely audible over the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. At first, I thought I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the silence. But as I sat up, straining to listen, the voice became clearer. It sounded like my mom, her soft, reassuring tone, speaking as if she were just in the next room. "Jenna," the voice whispered, gentle and almost comforting. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The rational part of me tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was an echo, some strange acoustic anomaly of the old house. Or maybe it was just a memory, my mind replaying the sound of her voice to soothe me. But the voice continued, whispering things that she'd never said, things that no one should know. "You left because you thought you'd find peace," it murmured. "But what you're really running from is yourself." The words sent a chill through me, cutting deep in a way that no ghost story or campfire tale ever could. It felt personal, invasive, like the voice was peeling back layers of myself I'd tried to hide even from myself. I wanted to scream, to run out of the house, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot, as if the floorboards themselves were holding me in place. After what felt like an eternity, the voice faded, leaving me alone with the darkness and my racing thoughts. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, my eyes wide and searching the shadows for any sign of movement. Every creak, every groan of the house felt like it was closing in on me, like the walls themselves were alive and watching. Morning brought a small sense of relief. The sunlight filtering through the old dusty windows made everything feel normal again, like it had all been a nightmare, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the memory of that voice lingered, haunting the back of my mind as I went about my day. I told myself it was stress, that the move and the isolation were getting to me. I tried to shake it off, to laugh at myself for being so easily spooked. After all, it was just a voice. It didn't mean anything. But as night fell again, the sense of dread returned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, every nerve on edge, waiting for the whisper to return. Hours passed in silence, and just as I started to drift off, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, like someone murmuring just beyond the walls. "Jenna." My heart pounded as I sat up, clutching the sheets tightly in my fists. The voice was closer this time, louder, as if whatever was speaking had moved a little closer. I wanted to believe it was still my imagination, some trick of the mind, but the tone was too real, too familiar. "Why are you running?" it whispered, the words barely audible but sharp, like a knife slicing through the quiet. "You can't hide from the truth." I shivered, feeling a cold sweat break out along my spine. This wasn't just some haunting echo. This was real as the floor beneath me and the walls around me. I was no longer alone in the house, and whatever was with me, it knew things no one else could know. I didn't leave the house the next day. Something held me back, a growing sense of dread that intensified every time I even considered stepping outside. The memory of the voice lingered, a shadow over every thought, every action. I tried to distract myself, diving into every possible chore, organizing closets, scrubbing floors that had been cleaned just yesterday, rearranging the living room furniture over and over. But no matter how hard I worked, the silence still crept back, heavy and suffocating, always reminding me that I was alone. The daylight offered some comfort, even if it was just an illusion. I told myself that everything would feel better by nightfall, that I'd exhausted myself so much with chores that I'd sleep soundly and peacefully. But as the sun began to set, a familiar fear gripped me. The shadows stretched, inching their way across the room as if they were alive, and I felt an odd prickling on the back of my neck, as if something was watching, waiting. I turned on every light in the house, desperate to keep the darkness at bay. Each room was bathed in a weak glow, but the old bulbs did little to ease my nerves. The walls still seemed to close in, and every corner was filled with looming shadows that seemed darker, thicker, as though they were hiding something just out of sight. When the clock struck midnight, the quiet deepened, becoming thick and tangible. I sat on the edge of my bed, my fingers tightly wrapped around my phone, considering calling my mom just to hear her voice. But something in me resisted, as if part of me knew that no voice from the outside could break through the suffocating silence that had settled here. Then it began again. "Jenna?" The whisper floated through the room, soft yet clear, curling around me like a cold breeze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I realized the voice was closer this time, almost as if it were coming from the very walls. I sat frozen, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it again, louder, sharper, almost angry. "You left to escape, didn't you?" I gasped, pressing my hand to my mouth, my mind spinning. The voice knew things no one else could possibly know. How could it know about my past, about what I was trying to forget? Panic bubbled up inside me, and I found myself scrambling off the bed, backing toward the door. But as I reached the threshold, the voice grew louder, filling the room with a suffocating presence. "You can't hide from yourself, Jenna. You'll always be here, waiting." I stumbled back, clutching the doorframe as I tried to steady myself. The voice was everywhere now, surrounding me, pressing in on all sides, as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. I felt trapped, cornered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was here, it wanted me to stay. In a desperate attempt to escape, I ran into the living room, flinging open the windows to let in the night air, hoping it would somehow dispel the darkness that clung to me. But the air outside was thick and still, offering no comfort, only a deeper silence. I closed my eyes, taking deep, shaky breaths, trying to steady myself. Minutes passed, and the house fell silent once more. The voice had faded, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt even more unsettling than the whispers. I closed the windows, locking them tightly, and returned to the bedroom, exhausted and shaken. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin like a shield, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though something was creeping closer, inching its way through the shadows toward me. Hours passed, and I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the voice's words over and over. I was no longer sure if I was awake or dreaming, caught in a fog of exhaustion and fear that blurred the lines of reality. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep into the room, I heard it again. "I'm so close, Jenna. I can almost reach you." The voice was a soft, sinister whisper, so close that I felt it brush against my ear. My blood ran cold, and I sat up, clutching the blankets as my eyes darted around the room. But there was nothing there. No one in sight. Just the same empty, silent room, filled with shadows that seemed to breathe along with me. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom, holding it to my ear with trembling hands. It rang, and I prayed that she would answer, that her voice would break through this nightmare and remind me that I wasn't truly alone. "Hello?" Her voice was groggy, confused. "Mom," my voice cracked, and I realized I was on the verge of tears. I just needed to hear you. Something's wrong here. I can feel it. There's a voice." There was a pause, and I could hear the concern in her tone as she responded. "Sweetie, are you sure it's not just the house settling? You've been through a lot. Maybe it's just stress. Houses have their own way of making noises, you know that." I tried to agree, to let her words soothe me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The voice was real, and it knew too much, felt too close. I thanked her, reassured her that I'd be fine, and hung up, though my heart was anything but settled. As I lay back down, clutching the phone in one hand and the blanket in the other, I closed my eyes, praying for sleep, for some brief escape from the waking nightmare that had taken over my life. But the silence that settled over me felt more like a threat than a comfort, and I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. The next day passed in a haze, the hours slipping by without me noticing. My body moved mechanically, unpacking boxes, scrubbing counters, but my mind was elsewhere, fixated on the voice. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an echo or some figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was here, waiting for me in the walls of this house, lurking in the shadows, biding its time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, I felt my stomach twist with dread. I knew the voice would return, and this time, I couldn't bear the thought of hearing it again, whispering those dark truths that cut through me like knives. I told myself that I'd leave, that I'd walk out the front door and never look back. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a force stronger than fear holding me in place. Night fell, and the house grew silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, pulsing with a hidden presence. I sat on the edge of my bed, my phone clutched tightly in my hand, heart racing as I waited. My eyes darted around the room, watching the shadows shift and move as if they were breathing, watching me. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it. "Jenna." The whisper was soft, almost affectionate, but there was an edge to it, a darkness that sent a chill down my spine. "Why do you hide from me?" I gripped the phone tighter, resisting the urge to cover my ears. "What do you want from me?" My voice came out shaky, barely a whisper, but the question hung in the air, pressing against the silence. The voice chuckled, a low, mocking sound that felt like icy fingers trailing down my skin. "I want you to remember, Jenna, to remember what you're running from." My heart pounded as the words sank in. Memories flooded back, fragments of the life I'd left behind, the things I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten them. The divorce, the loss, the mistakes I couldn't forgive myself for, all the shadows of my past, clawing their way back to the surface. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like the voice was peeling back layers of me I'd tried to forget. "You can't run from yourself," it whispered, each word slicing through me. "You'll always be here, waiting in the dark." Desperation clawed at me as I looked around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just shadows and silence. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating me, trapping me in a prison of my own making. And then I saw it. A faint outline in the wall, just across from my bed, a crack that hadn't been there before. It seemed to pulse, as if something was alive inside, pressing against the surface, straining to break free. My heart raced as I moved toward it, compelled by a force I couldn't resist. My hand trembled as I reached out, fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface of the wall. As soon as I touched it, the voice grew louder, filling the room, wrapping around me like a vice. "Let me in, Jenna," it hissed, the words thick with malice. "Let me out." Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, heart pounding. I wanted to run, to escape, but something kept me there, frozen in place, watching as the crack in the wall widened, shadows spilling out like smoke, curling through the room. And then I saw her, my own reflection, twisted and warped, staring back at me from the darkness within the wall. Her eyes were cold, filled with a hatred I couldn't understand, and her mouth twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "You can't hide from me, Jenna," she whispered, her voice overlapping with the sinister echo of the voice in the walls. "I am you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled back, my mind reeling. She stepped forward, reaching out, her hand pressing against the surface of the wall, mirroring my own. It was as if she were trying to break through, to cross into my world. I backed away, heart pounding, but the shadows seemed to follow, creeping toward me, pulling me in. I could feel her presence, suffocating, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I knew I couldn't escape. In a final act of desperation, I turned and ran, stumbling out of the room, down the hall, and out the front door. The cold night air hit me like a shock, but I didn't stop. I ran down the driveway, through the trees, not daring to look back, the weight of the shadows pressing against me, pushing me forward. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I looked back at the house. It stood there, silent and dark, watching me with empty windows like eyes, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting. I felt her gaze on me, that twisted reflection, and I knew that no matter how far I ran, she would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I left Vermont that night, abandoning the house and everything in it. But even now I can still feel her presence, lingering just out of sight, watching me from the darkness, waiting for the day I'll return. Because I know, deep down, that the voice was right. I can't run from myself. It was late when I finally set down the last box in the corner of my new living room, my body aching from hours of lifting and organizing. The house was smaller than I'd envisioned, a modest one-story tucked away in a quiet suburban street with only a handful of neighbors. But that was part of the charm, I'd told myself. No traffic noise, no prying eyes. I'd craved solitude after my recent breakup, hoping to heal in the peace of my own space. Yet, as I stood there that first night, surrounded by the silence, something felt off. It was almost too quiet, as if the house was holding its breath along with me. I brushed the feeling off, attributing it to exhaustion, and went through my nightly ritual, brushing my teeth, slipping into pajamas, and checking the doors and windows. I've always had a bit of a paranoid streak. Alone in a new place, it was heightened. Each lock clicked louder than usual. Each creak in the floor seemed amplified. Finally, I slid into bed, willing myself to embrace the calm. But it was then, in that fragile moment of near sleep, that I first heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. I held my breath, straining to hear. But the sound was persistent, almost rhythmic, as if it were inside the walls. I got up, cautiously walking through each room, checking the windows and the doors again, feeling more like a trespasser than a homeowner. I found nothing, just shadows and the low hum of the refrigerator, which seemed louder now in the stillness. I finally returned to bed, clutching my phone. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I half laughed at myself. "It's just an old house," I muttered. "Creaky walls, leaky pipes. Stop freaking out, Sarah." With a final shaky exhale, I closed my eyes, sinking into uneasy sleep. But the peace didn't last. It was around 2 in the morning when my phone vibrated violently on the nightstand, jolting me awake. I picked it up, groggy and disoriented. My heart lurched as I saw the caller ID. It was my own number flashing on the screen. Confused, I let it ring out, chalking it up to some weird tech glitch. My brain, still foggy from sleep, didn't fully process the oddity of it until I lay back down. But I couldn't ignore it the second time it happened. The phone vibrated again, and there it was, my number, my own name, staring back at me from the screen. This time I answered, "Hello?" My voice came out shaky, almost a whisper. The other end was silent. No static, no background noise, just empty, hollow silence. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, a voice, an answer, even the click of a hang-up. But all I heard was the emptiness, pressing in on me. Shivering, I hung up and quickly silenced my phone, setting it back on the nightstand as if to shut out the possibility of more calls. But sleep didn't come again that night. The next morning, I went about my day trying to forget the unsettling incident. It had to have been a glitch. Technology could be strange that way, I reasoned. And yet, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound in the house, listening for the faintest creak or whisper. By dusk, as shadows began to stretch across the walls, the quiet felt less peaceful and more ominous. Later that night, just as I was finally drifting off, it happened again. This time, the vibration startled me so much I nearly dropped the phone as I grabbed it. And once again, my number was calling me, my name, my own number. The horror seeped in slowly, like a chill climbing up my spine. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button, dread pooling in my stomach. But something in me, a need for answers perhaps, forced my hand. I pressed answer and held the phone to my ear, heart pounding so hard it hurt. For a moment, I thought the line was dead. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, I heard a soft, steady breathing on the other end. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I listened. And then a whisper. So faint it was almost part of the silence itself. "I'm watching every move you make." The words slithered through the phone, curling around my mind. I jerked the phone away, staring at it as if it had bitten me. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't catch my breath. In a panic, I threw the phone onto the other side of the bed, grabbing a blanket to wrap around myself, as if that thin fabric could protect me from whatever horror was lurking behind that voice. Hours later, the sun crept into the room, weak but warm. I spent the day trying to convince myself it had all been a dream. I went about unpacking, doing everything to keep myself busy, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. I avoided looking at my phone, afraid it might ring again. I had to know what was going on, but fear held me back. Maybe it would be better to never know. The day crawled by, weighed down by a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes made my heart race. I couldn't help but glance nervously at my phone, expecting it to vibrate, to light up with another call. By evening, the fear had settled into a deep, anxious ache that I could neither justify nor ignore. When the sun began to sink behind the trees, shadows stretched long and thin across my living room walls, transforming my once cozy space into something ominous. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, just a glitch, a prank, an overactive imagination. But as darkness crept in, that explanation grew flimsier, and my mind played tricks on me. The house felt too quiet, the silence punctuated by each tiny sound as if it were amplified. I busied myself with anything I could find, organizing kitchen cabinets, wiping counters, scrubbing floors, anything to keep my mind off the phone. But the longer I ignored it, the heavier the silence became. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to acknowledge that something wasn't right. Finally, I sat down on the couch, exhausted, telling myself I needed to stop being ridiculous. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and leaned back, hoping the calm would settle over me. Just as my breathing slowed, my phone vibrated on the coffee table, and my eyes shot open, my heart pounding. It was my number. Again. I stared at it, frozen, as the screen pulsed with each ring. It was like staring into a mirror, seeing my own name and number reflected back at me in a way that felt inherently wrong. Part of me wanted to ignore it, let it ring until it stopped. But another part of me needed to know. I needed to hear the voice to confirm that it wasn't real, that it was just a fluke. With trembling fingers, I picked up the phone and swiped to answer. "Hello," I managed, barely above a whisper. There was silence at first. A hollow, empty silence that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. I could feel my own pulse in my throat, waiting, listening. And then there it was again, the faint, steady breathing. Each inhale and exhale felt like a cold breeze against my ear, sending chills through me. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The silence continued, unbroken, and I was just about to hang up when I heard it. "I'm watching every move you make." The voice was the same, low, chilling, almost snake-like, slithering through the line and wrapping around my thoughts. But this time it continued. "And I can see you, right now." Panic surged through me, and I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, backing away from the coffee table, my eyes scanning the room. It was a ridiculous thought, irrational, even, but I couldn't shake it. The feeling that someone was here, hiding, watching. I double-checked the locks, pacing through each room, calling out in a desperate attempt to confront whoever, or whatever, was tormenting me. The phone vibrated again, this time sending a deep jolt of fear through my entire body. I ignored it, my mind racing as I tried to piece together what was happening. I wanted to believe it was all some sick joke, but the chill creeping up my spine told me otherwise. Somehow, someone had my number, my name, my location. Somehow, they were inside my home. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind outside, every shadow on the walls felt threatening. The phone vibrated a few more times, each call unanswered, each leaving an increasing sense of dread. The thought of calling the police entered my mind, but I dismissed it, ashamed of how insane I'd sound, calling about ghost calls from my own number. It was nearly dawn when I finally gave up on sleep and sat on the edge of my bed, phone clutched tightly in my hand. I was tired, but more than that, I was afraid. Afraid of the next call, of that voice, of the unsettling truth that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone. When the sun finally rose, casting faint light over the rooms, I felt the dread ease slightly. The daylight had a way of dispelling the terror that clung to me, even if only temporarily. I got dressed and resolved to call the police, willing to face the embarrassment if it meant I might find answers. At the station, I recounted the calls as best I could. The officer, a broad, tired-looking man, nodded as he took notes, his expression shifting from polite interest to a mild look of confusion as I continued. "And you're saying these calls are coming from your own number?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, anxiety bubbling in my stomach. "Yes, I know it sounds crazy, but that's what it says. My own number, and the voice." He held up a hand to stop me, glancing at his partner, who gave a small shrug. "Look, we can check the records, see if anything unusual shows up. But in cases like this, it's usually a technical glitch, maybe even a prank. People can spoof numbers, make it look like it's coming from anywhere." I clung to the idea, desperate for any explanation, rational or not. I agreed to let them investigate, even gave them my phone for a few hours. They suggested I change my number, which I did, thinking that would finally put an end to it. Yet as I left the station, a gnawing feeling lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the relief of having the police involved. Maybe now, with a new number and a little more support, things would finally settle. But later that night, when I sat down on my bed, feeling a sliver of peace for the first time in days, my phone vibrated once more. And there it was, my name, my new number, calling me. I could barely breathe as I stared at the screen. My own name, my new number, somehow it had followed me. My hand shook as I declined the call, tossing the phone onto the bed as if it were toxic. My mind raced, grasping at straws, desperate to find some explanation. Changing my number was supposed to end this. How was it possible that they'd found me again? I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it hadn't happened, but I knew that was impossible. I was terrified of the next ring, but the silence that filled the room afterward was somehow even worse. Every shadow seemed to creep closer. Every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye set my pulse racing. I was trapped between fear and dread, waiting for something I couldn't understand. Hours passed and the house grew darker as night fell. I tried to distract myself, turning on every light, putting on music, even attempting to read. But no matter what I did, the phone haunted me. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward it, wondering if it would ring again. I felt like prey, hiding from a predator that was lurking just out of sight. Then, around midnight, it happened. The phone buzzed again, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. My name and number flashed on the screen, taunting me. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the answer button, torn between wanting answers and dreading what I might hear. Against every instinct, I answered, pressing the phone to my ear with trembling hands. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. I thought for a moment that maybe this time there would be nothing. No voice, no whisper, just the hollow emptiness I'd come to fear. But then, so softly that it was almost drowned out by my own breathing, I heard it. "Are you scared, Sarah?" The voice was a low, raspy whisper, dripping with malice. It sounded familiar, like an echo of something I should recognize but couldn't quite place. My stomach twisted as I listened, every word sinking into my skin like ice. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but I was frozen, unable to move or speak. "I'm watching you, Sarah," the voice continued, soft and mocking. "Every step, every breath, I know it all." I dropped the phone, stumbling back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. My heart hammered in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out along my skin. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was lurking just beyond my sight, waiting. Desperate, I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed, but found nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to me, heavy and suffocating. The shadows seemed to pulse with hidden eyes, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Finally, out of sheer exhaustion, I collapsed onto the couch, clutching the knife with one hand and my phone with the other. I couldn't bring myself to turn it off, as if somehow having it close would protect me from the horror that had invaded my life. Sleep was out of the question. I sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock, waiting for the next call. Dawn broke eventually, casting a pale light over the room. I felt like a ghost myself, hollowed out and worn down, but alive. My mind was frayed, but I knew I couldn't go on like this. Whatever was happening, it was beyond my control, and I needed help. I called the police again, my voice shaky as I explained that the calls had returned despite changing my number. They seemed more skeptical this time, as though they doubted my story. One of the officers even suggested I might be imagining things, a response that only heightened my frustration and fear. Feeling defeated, I hung up, my last bit of hope slipping away. I was truly alone in this. Nobody believed me, and no one was coming to help. I was left with nothing but the creeping dread that I was being hunted, stalked by an invisible presence that knew my every move. As the day dragged on, I tried to keep busy, anything to keep the panic at bay. But every time I glanced at the phone, the fear surged anew. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. I was a prisoner in my own home, haunted by a voice that shouldn't exist. By nightfall, I was desperate. I sat on my bed, clutching the phone, trying to work up the courage to answer if it rang again. I needed to confront this thing, to get some answers, to understand who or what was tormenting me. I couldn't keep living like this, in a constant state of fear and paranoia. As if in answer to my thoughts, the phone vibrated, and I felt my heart lurch. This time I didn't hesitate. I swiped to answer, holding my breath as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Who are you?" The silence was heavier than ever, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, finally, the voice spoke. "Look behind you, Sarah." The line went dead, leaving me in suffocating silence. I could feel every muscle in my body tense, my skin prickling with fear. My eyes drifted toward the mirror across the room, where I could see my own pale reflection, wide-eyed and trembling. Slowly, almost against my will, I turned around, my gaze sweeping the room. There was nothing there, just empty shadows and the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the window. But the feeling remained, that creeping, suffocating sensation of being watched. I couldn't shake the thought that, somehow, the threat was closer than I ever could have imagined. The darkness felt heavier than ever, pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. My mind raced, desperate for a logical explanation, but I was left with only questions and the chilling certainty that something was terribly wrong. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the distant ticking of a clock. I sat frozen, afraid to breathe, afraid to move, as if any sound might provoke whatever presence I felt lingering in the shadows. The phone lay silent in my lap, but I clutched it like a lifeline, my hands trembling. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. I'd already tried the police, and friends were out of the question. How could I explain this? How could I make them understand that I was being hunted by something invisible, something that knew me better than I knew myself? In a last act of desperation, I pulled myself together and began to search the house. I checked every corner, every closet, every crevice. My heart pounded as I moved through the empty rooms, half expecting something, someone, to leap out at me from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the silence and the weight of unseen eyes following my every move. Finally, I returned to my bedroom, exhausted and defeated. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror across the room. My own eyes looked back at me, wide and haunted. My face pale and gaunt, I barely recognized myself. It was as if I were looking at a stranger. And then, without warning, the phone vibrated in my hand, the sudden noise sending a shock through my system. I looked down, and my stomach dropped. My own name, my own number. It was happening again. This time, something in me snapped. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I was done running. I was done hiding. With a surge of defiance, I answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear with a trembling hand. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice hoarse but steady. "Why are you doing this?" The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, and for a moment I thought they wouldn't respond. But then, just as I was about to hang up, the voice came through, soft and chillingly familiar. "I'm closer than you think, Sarah." The words slithered through the phone, and my blood ran cold. I looked around, scanning the empty room, but there was nothing, just shadows and the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. I felt trapped, like an animal caught in a cage, unable to escape the invisible eyes that watched me from every corner. "Where are you?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The voice chuckled, a low, mocking sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm right here, Sarah. I've always been here." Panic surged through me as I frantically searched the room, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of a presence. And then, in a sudden, horrifying moment of clarity, it hit me. The voice, the way it spoke, the tone, the cadence, it was mine. My own voice, twisted and warped, but unmistakably mine. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the phone, my mind reeling with the realization. Somehow, impossibly, I was the one haunting myself. The calls, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it had all been coming from me. But how? How could I be both the victim and the tormentor? My reflection in the mirror caught my eye, and a chill ran through me as I stared at it. The woman looking back at me wasn't just pale and exhausted. She looked wrong. Her eyes were darker, her expression twisted into a faint, mocking smile that didn't belong to me. And then, as I watched in horror, my reflection raised a hand, waving slowly, tauntingly. My own hand remained still at my side, but the woman in the mirror moved on her own, her smile widening into a grin that sent a surge of terror through me. "No," I whispered, backing away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the reflection didn't stop. She leaned closer, her face filling the glass, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me feel like I was being pulled in, swallowed by her gaze. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, held captive by my own eyes. "Are you scared, Sarah?" she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "You should be, because now I'm free." With a final mocking smile, she faded into the shadows, leaving the mirror empty. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. The room felt colder, darker, as if a piece of me had been ripped away. I looked down at my phone, but the screen was blank, the call long ended. I was alone, truly alone, but the feeling of being watched remained. The house felt hollow, empty, but somehow I knew that she, my reflection, my shadow, whatever she was still here, lurking just out of sight. waiting for the next time I'd look in the mirror. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, I knew that I would never be safe again. Because no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, she would always be there, watching me, waiting. And now I understood the terrible truth. I wasn't just haunted. I was possessed.